What if the movies that reshaped American science fiction were born in the foggy backlots of Britain, not Hollywood? Imagine forgotten experiments in film that failed at home but planted the seeds for global cinematic revolutions. These were the stories too strange, too cerebral, too ahead of their time. They flopped, then vanished, yet their influence echoed through generations. Let's uncover 15 forgotten British sci-fi bombs that secretly changed American cinema. Number 15. The Man Who Fell to Earth, 1976. It was a failure that broke boundaries. Nicholas Roeg's. The Man Who Fell to Earth baffled British critics and audiences. They called it pretentious, slow, even incoherent. Yet this supposed bomb would quietly reshape the visual grammar of science fiction forever. The story followed an alien who crashes on Earth seeking water for his dying planet. Played by David Bowie, the character became a mirror of loneliness, addiction, and spiritual decay. It was not the tale of rockets and monsters audiences expected. It was a fever dream about what it means to lose yourself in a world of greed. But British studios panicked. The tone was too adult, too strange, too unmarketable. American distributors hacked away at the running time slicing scenes that made the narrative barely hold together. The American version confused critics and alienated theatergoers. Yet underground audiences saw something else, a vision of sci-fi, not about technology, but emotion. Years later, filmmakers like Ridley Scott and Denis Villeneuve would cite it as a visual influence. The disorienting cross cuts the sterile human world, the alien, as metaphor for capitalism, all became part of American science fiction's DNA. It was a film that died on release, but lived on as prophecy. In the wreckage of its failure, a new language of cinematic alienation was born. Number 14. Quatermass and the Pit, 1967. When Hammer Films released Quatermass and the Pit, it should have been a success. The Quatermass serials were already British institutions, yet this eerie, intelligent adaptation was too unsettling, too philosophical to satisfy thrill seekers of the day. The story begins when construction workers in London uncover an ancient spaceship buried under the city. The discovery awakens terrifying psychic powers in the human population, suggesting that mankind's violent instincts were implanted by alien visitors millions of years ago. It was part horror, part anthropology, part cosmic dread. The British censors nearly halted it, claiming its ideas about human evolution and mass hysteria bordered on blasphemy. Hammer trimmed nothing, standing by its cerebral terror. But American audiences had no idea what to make of it. There were no clean heroes, no easy monsters. The film tanked in the United States and barely broke even in the United Kingdom. Yet the echoes were immense. Decades later, John Carpenter would channel its atmosphere into Prince of Darkness. The X-Files borrowed its archaeology of fear. Even Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters drew from its imagery of glowing excavations and collective awakening. Quatermass and the Pit proved that British science fiction could be terrifying without a single laser blast. It was an apocalypse of the mind, long before America dared to face one. Number 13. The Day the Earth Caught Fire, 1961. It began as a warning and ended as a catastrophe. The Day the Earth Caught Fire was a British newsroom drama disguised as a disaster movie. It opened to critical confusion and box office indifference. But buried in its ashes was a new kind of realism that would later fuel American disaster epics. The plot follows two weary London journalists discovering that nuclear tests have tilted the Earth's axis. The planet is slowly spiraling toward the sun. Instead of melodrama, the film gave viewers something scarier: truth. The dialogue was naturalistic. The panic understated the apocalypse, quietly believable. Censors hated its political tone. It accused both East and West of arrogance in the atomic age. American distributors demanded edits that softened its anti-nuclear message. The British press called it grim, uncommercial, too serious for a summer audience. But over the years, its legacy burned hotter. Directors like Roland Emmerich and George Miller would borrow its sense of scale grounded in human fragility. Its handheld chaos and smog-drenched London would inspire the look of modern eco-thrillers and post-apocalyptic dramas. The Day the Earth Caught Fire showed that the end of the world could begin not in outer space, but in a newsroom. It was not loud, not flashy, just inevitable. And that quiet terror would change the way American cinema imagined doom. Number 12, The Mind Benders, 1963. When The Mind Benders premiered, British critics were unsure what to call it. A thriller, a psychological experiment, a failure. The film's quiet release made almost no impact, yet its influence on American science fiction would become undeniable. Set in Oxford, the story follows a professor who undergoes sensory deprivation to uncover the truth behind a colleague's mysterious death. What begins as a controlled experiment turns into a hallucinatory nightmare as the professor's mind unravels. The imagery of isolation tanks, bodies floating in silence and minds collapsing, would later echo through American classics like Altered States and The Matrix. The British Board of Film Censors debated whether its depiction of psychological manipulation was too disturbing. Religious groups protested its suggestion that identity could be stripped away through science. Studios feared it was too intellectual for mass audiences. It flopped, vanishing almost instantly from theaters. Yet American filmmakers watched in secret. Ken Russell borrowed its aesthetic for his own madness-fueled visions. Hollywood studios studied its low-budget claustrophobia, realizing that fear could come not from monsters, but from the limits of human perception itself. The Mind Benders dared to show science as a weapon against the soul. It predicted a new era where technology would no longer just explore space, but dissect the human mind. Forgotten in its time, it quietly rewired what American cinema thought science fiction could be. Number 11. The Damned, 1962. Hammer Films thought they were making a youth rebellion movie with some science fiction seasoning. What they released was one of the strangest, most unsettling films of the decade. The Damned flopped so badly, it was pulled from theaters within weeks. But its radioactive message would linger for generations. The film begins with a gang of young thugs led by Oliver Reed terrorizing tourists in a British seaside town. When one victim escapes, he discovers a hidden government facility housing children who are radioactive, the result of secret experiments designed to outlive nuclear war. Audiences expecting cheap thrills got existential horror. Critics dismissed it as incoherent. The censors delayed its release for nearly 2 years, arguing its depiction of government cruelty was subversive. American distributors recut it, stripping away the ending's bleak revelations. The result satisfied no one. But time transformed it. Its eerie imagery of doomed innocence inspired future works, from Village of the Damned to Stranger Things. It predicted the paranoia of Cold War America, the fear that governments would sacrifice morality for survival. The Damned was buried by its own daring, but its ghost lived on. It showed that horror and science fiction could merge not for entertainment, but for warning. The children in that underground bunker were never just characters. They were the future we refused to see. Number 10. The Man in the White Suit, 1951. It looked like a comedy, and in some ways, it was. Alec Guinness played a humble chemist who invents an indestructible fabric that never wears out. But beneath the laughter was one of the darkest science fiction allegories ever written. When it premiered, audiences chuckled, then they stopped. The Man in the White Suit explored the terror of progress itself. If clothes never aged, the entire textile industry would collapse. Factories would close, workers would revolt. The scientist becomes an outcast, hunted by both businessmen and labor unions, terrified of the chaos his invention could unleash. Critics in Britain admired its wit, but not its unease. American audiences were baffled. It was science fiction with no spaceships, no romance, no triumph. Just a warning that invention might destroy society. Behind the scenes, Ealing Studios struggled to market it. Studio executives feared audiences would reject its cynicism. The film underperformed, but left a profound mark on American filmmakers who saw its satire as prophetic. Its influence can be traced in everything from RoboCop to Iron Man, where innovation leads to isolation. The Man in the White Suit dared to say that the future could not be manufactured without moral cost. It laughed softly while predicting the world we live in now, where every miracle comes with a shadow. Number 9. The Earth Dies Screaming, 1964. When The Earth Dies Screaming hit British cinemas, it was dismissed as pulp. Critics sneered at its title, audiences stayed away, and distributors barely pushed it outside the United Kingdom. Yet this supposed low-budget bomb would quietly shape the tone of American apocalyptic cinema for decades. Directed by Terence Fisher, a master of gothic horror for Hammer Studios, the film opens in eerie silence. Trains crash, cars swerve off roads, and entire towns fall still. Within minutes, the human race is nearly wiped out. The survivors discover that an alien invasion has poisoned Earth's atmosphere and reanimated corpses as drones of conquest. At first glance, it looked like cheap matinee material, but the way Fisher filmed it changed everything. Instead of fast-paced spectacle, he used long stretches of quiet dread. Streets stood empty, fog rolled through abandoned villages, and survivors argued rather than united. It was not about monsters, it was about what loneliness does to people when society collapses. Censors complained that its grim tone would depress audiences. American distributors wanted more explosions, less silence. The edits dulled its bleak power. The movie vanished from theaters almost as quickly as it arrived. But filmmakers like George A. Romero would later cite its mood as direct inspiration for Night of the Living Dead. The slow, staggering movement of the possessed corpses, the tension inside a boarded-up safe house, the paranoia among survivors, all began here. The Earth dies. Screaming became a ghost of influence, haunting American directors who wanted to turn sci-fi into social allegory. It was a film about extinction, not invasion, a whisper of the end that taught cinema to fear silence more than sound. Number 8. The Man Who Could Cheat Death, 1959. Hammer Films released The Man Who Could Cheat Death, expecting another gothic success. Instead, it became one of their most notorious failures. Critics called it dreary, too talkative, too philosophical. But hidden beneath its disappointing reception was a concept that American cinema would later build empires upon. The story follows a Victorian doctor who discovers a serum granting him immortality, but at a gruesome cost. Every 10 years, he must replace parts of his body with tissue from unwilling donors. The film's tone was eerie and introspective, focusing on obsession rather than spectacle. British audiences expecting monsters were bewildered. American audiences ignored it completely. The British Board of Film Censors nearly banned the movie for its surgical implications. The idea of a scientist harvesting body parts for eternal youth was considered too morbid. Paramount altered scenes for the U.S. release, cutting the moral dialogue and leaving only fragments of its horror. Without context, it collapsed at the box office. Yet, the idea endured. American films like The Fly Reanimator and even modern science thrillers such as Selfless carried its DNA. The Man Who Could Cheat Death suggested that immortality was the ultimate corruption, a theme that would dominate decades of cinema. Behind the scenes, Hammer's crew faced production turmoil. Original star Peter Cushing quit weeks before filming and was replaced by Anton Diffring. The rushed shoot and studio interference stripped it of energy but not of power. Its melancholy atmosphere would influence American horror directors who saw in it a model for tragic science fiction. What seemed like a failure in 1959 was actually the beginning of a new narrative, that progress without ethics is madness. It was not a tale about monsters, but about man himself. Number 7. Saturn III. 1980. When Saturn III arrived, it was supposed to be Britain's answer to Alien. Instead, it imploded into one of the strangest misfires of the era, a glossy, star-studded disaster that quietly inspired the aesthetics of future dystopian films. The movie stars Kirk Douglas and Farrah Fawcett as scientists stationed on Saturn's moon, whose lonely research mission is interrupted by a psychotic astronaut and his humanoid robot, Hector. On paper, it had everything: big names, sleek sets, and Hollywood backing. But chaos ruled behind the camera. Director John Barry, fresh from designing Star Wars, was fired mid-shoot after clashes with Douglas. Stanley Donen took over, but never grasped the tone, halfway between erotic thriller and techno-horror. The result was an expensive curiosity that baffled audiences. Critics called it a plastic nightmare. British theaters emptied. In America, it barely made a whisper. Yet its visuals, chrome corridors, body horror robotics, and sexual paranoia, became a blueprint for later American sci-fi. Filmmakers from James Cameron to Paul Verhoeven cited its design language as an influence. Even Ex Machina echoes its cold, isolated intimacy between humans and machines. Saturn III failed as a story, but triumphed as a mood, a claustrophobic vision of desire and technology entwined. In its wreckage lay the birth of a darker, sleeker, sci-fi aesthetic that America would later perfect. Number 6. The Final Program, 1973. The Final Program was meant to be Britain's answer to A Clockwork Orange. It ended up being a box office disaster that critics laughed at. Yet buried in its surreal chaos lay the blueprint for cyberpunk and the dark aesthetic that would later dominate American sci-fi. Based on Michael Moorcock's cult novel, it follows Jerry Cornelius, a wealthy playboy scientist, in a decaying near future. He embarks on a quest to locate a computer program capable of creating the next evolution of humanity. The tone was psychedelic, the visuals hallucinatory, and the story defied logic. It was part satire, part apocalypse, part fever dream. British critics hated it. They called it incoherent, indulgent, and too weird for mainstream audiences. American distributors barely touched it. Even Hammer rejected the project, seeing it as too intellectual to sell. But its vision of decayed technology, moral collapse, and artificial rebirth would inspire a generation of filmmakers. Director Robert Fuest, known for the abominable Dr. Phibes, infused the movie with neon-soaked surrealism years before Blade Runner would popularize the look. His use of sleek machinery and nihilistic humor predicted the cynical tone that became a hallmark of American dystopian films. Behind the scenes, chaos ruled. The production ran out of money halfway through shooting, forcing rewrites and rushed sets. Studio executives demanded changes to make it coherent, but Fuest refused. The film opened quietly and closed even faster. Yet, within art house circles, it found new life, inspiring American directors like Alex Cox and John Carpenter, who admired its fusion of absurdity and apocalypse. The Final Program was a vision ahead of its time. It dared to say the end of the world would not be a bang, but a joke. A strange British failure that taught America how to find poetry in ruin. Number 5. Privilege, 1967. Privilege was a movie nobody wanted. It mocked religion, consumerism, and pop culture all at once. When it premiered, British critics dismissed it as hysterical, and American audiences never even saw it. But this forgotten satire would later become a secret manual for dystopian storytelling in Hollywood. Set in a near-future Britain, it tells the story of Stephen Shorter, a pop star turned government puppet. His concerts are orchestrated propaganda events designed to pacify the masses through spectacle and emotion. When he tries to rebel, the system destroys him publicly and spiritually. It was a chilling vision of celebrity as control a theme that would later fuel films like Network and The Hunger Games. The film's release was disastrous. The Church of England condemned it for depicting religion as a political tool. The BBC refused to promote it. British distributors cut scenes showing mass crowds in hysteria, fearing they mirrored real political rallies. When it reached the United States, the studio quietly buried it after 1 week of poor attendance. Behind the camera, director Peter Watkins faced threats and was blacklisted by the British industry. He would never make another major studio film again. Yet the ideas he unleashed, mass media manipulation and state-manufactured fame, became prophetic. Years later, filmmakers from Sidney Lumet to Paul Verhoeven would explore the same themes. American cinema absorbed its paranoia, turning Watkins' tragedy into blockbuster entertainment. Privilege was the movie that saw the future of politics and pop culture merging before anyone else. It was too true for its time, and that was its curse. A forgotten British bomb that whispered a warning America turned into prophecy. Number 4. Phase 4. 1974. Few films in history failed so completely, yet aged so prophetically as Phase 4. It was the only feature directed by Saul Bass, the legendary designer behind Hitchcock's title sequences, and it proved that even geniuses could bomb in Britain. Shot in surreal desert landscapes, it told of ants evolving a collective intelligence and turning against humanity. No monsters, no lasers, just cold, mathematical rebellion from nature itself. British distributors panicked, unable to market a film where insects were the heroes. American audiences avoided it entirely, but beneath the failure lay innovation. Phase 4 was one of the first sci-fi films to treat evolution as cosmic intelligence rather than horror. Its symmetrical compositions, eerie silence, and insect POV shots would later influence Close Encounters, Arrival, and even Annihilation. Behind the scenes, Bass fought with Paramount over the ending, a psychedelic sequence showing the merger of man and ant consciousness. The studio cut it, leaving the film incomprehensible. The missing ending became a legend among filmmakers. Decades later, it was rediscovered and hailed as visionary. Phase 4 was mocked in its time, but its DNA crawled into every American sci-fi film that saw nature as sentient. It failed in theaters, but succeeded in whispering an idea that would take half a century to bloom. Number 3. X, the Unknown, 1956. Long before. The Blob crawled across American drive-ins, a smaller, quieter film from Britain, terrified audiences with an eerily similar concept. X, the Unknown, was meant to be just another quick Hammer monster flick. Instead, it became a creative disaster that would accidentally inspire decades of American sci-fi horror. The story begins at a British Army base where soldiers testing Geiger counters discover radiation levels spiking from deep underground. Soon, a bubbling, amorphous creature emerges, feeding on atomic energy and burning anything in its path. It was raw, terrifying, and ahead of its time. But Hammer's censors and executives panicked. The British Board of Film Censors tried to halt production, claiming the script was too disturbing for post-war audiences still haunted by Hiroshima. The director Joseph Losey, who had fled the United States during the McCarthy era, was forced off the project because of his political background. That scandal cursed the movie before it even began. When it finally premiered, critics were divided. Some called it childish, others found its realism unnerving. The monster effects were primitive, yet the tone was pure dread. Audiences expecting adventure got existential horror. The film barely recouped its costs and faded into obscurity. But across the Atlantic, American filmmakers took notice. They saw in X the Unknown a blueprint for paranoia-driven monster movies, creatures born not of fantasy, but of human invention. Its themes of radiation and hubris echoed through films like The Incredible Shrinking Man and Them. Even Ridley Scott later cited it as an influence on Alien. What Britain dismissed as another B-movie became the seed for America's atomic age nightmares. X. The Unknown proved that true horror comes not from space, but from the depths beneath our own soil. It failed at the box office, but succeeded in warning the world what science was capable of unearthing. Number 2. The Giant Behemoth, 1959. At first glance, The Giant Behemoth looked like just another monster flick. A radioactive dinosaur rampaging through London should have been an easy sell, yet it bombed catastrophically in Britain and barely made a ripple in the United States. Still, it would quietly ignite an obsession in American cinema that lasted decades. The story follows scientists investigating a rash of dead fish along the English coast, only to discover a prehistoric creature awakened and mutated by nuclear testing. The effects were crude, the pacing uneven, and the dialogue wooden. Critics shredded it. But its central fear, that humanity's arrogance had reawakened nature's wrath, would become a defining motif in American blockbusters from Godzilla to Jurassic Park. Behind the scenes, chaos reigned. The American producers demanded constant rewrites, while the British crew worked with almost no budget. Stop-motion sequences were shot weeks before release using borrowed equipment. The final product was a patchwork of brilliance and disaster. Censors complained that it was too violent for children, yet too silly for adults. It vanished within weeks. But its imagery of London under siege from a prehistoric beast fascinated American filmmakers. They saw potential in its theme of science, backfiring on civilization. When Spielberg unleashed Jurassic Park, decades later, critics noted the resemblance, the wounded majesty of the creature, the moral panic, the confrontation between science and nature. The Giant Behemoth had planted the DNA for that fear long before Hollywood gave it a roar. It failed in every measurable way, but its vision survived. The British filmmakers who made it never imagined that their doomed monster would become the ancestor of America's biggest cinematic beasts. Sometimes, failure can be evolution in disguise. Number 1. The Man Who Haunted Himself, 1970. No one expected a low-budget psychological thriller about identity to reshape the language of science fiction. Yet, The Man Who Haunted Himself did exactly that, decades after it was forgotten. Starring Roger Moore in a rare dramatic role, it tells the story of a conservative businessman who, after surviving a car crash, discovers another version of himself living his life better, faster, and more ruthlessly. Was it madness, cloning, or cosmic punishment? The film never answers. That ambiguity doomed it commercially, but made it immortal in theory. British audiences rejected it. Critics dismissed it as confusing. Even Roger Moore later called it one of his personal favorites, yet admitted no one understood it. American distributors released it quietly, and it disappeared within a month. But what it explored, the duality of self in an age of technology, would later echo in Blade Runner: The Prestige and countless identity thrillers. Its haunting mood and minimalist visuals gave American filmmakers a new template for depicting inner collapse as science fiction. Behind the scenes, director Basil Dearden fought constant studio interference. Executives wanted clarity, he wanted mystery. They clashed until post-production, when Dearden tragically died in a car accident, similar to the one depicted in the film. The eerie coincidence sealed the movie's legend, but also its doom. For decades, The Man Who Haunted Himself remained buried until rediscovered by scholars studying the roots of psychological sci-fi. Its quiet story of duplication and dread became the philosophical backbone of later American masterpieces about artificial intelligence and consciousness. It was not about aliens or monsters, but something far more terrifying: the stranger living inside ourselves. Britain ignored it, America listened, and cinema was never the same again. 15 British sci-fi bombs, 15 failures that secretly rewired American imagination. They were too strange, too bold, too early. Yet from their ashes came the blockbusters the world remembers. So, which of these forgotten films do you think deserves resurrection? Comment below and keep this story alive. Like, share, and subscribe for more cinematic archaeology.